UK politician and frontrunner for most pompous voice, Nigel Farage, has been in the media lately for some comments he made about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he seems to be parroting a Russian talking point, but I actually think even he knows he's full of it. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's break this one down. So, this is a pretty interesting interview. Nigel Farage, in an interview with the BBC, actually says that the West provoked Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And this is one of those talking points that really annoys me, particularly because it is a Russian talking point that Russia itself doesn't use. Putin himself doesn't actually even use this when selling the war to the Russian people, right? So the fact that so many Western politicians use this as a pretext is itself just unbelievably annoying, right? So here's the actual comments he made. Right? He once said that he had been predicting a war in Ukraine as early as 2014. He said, quote, "It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and go to war," Farage said in the BBC interview. But then he said, "We provoked this war. Of course, it's Putin's fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse." And this is, if you're like, that's sort of saying two different things, it's absolutely correct. First off, Nigel Farage annoys me on a basic level because he's sitting there saying, I predicted a war in Ukraine in 2014. The war in Ukraine had begun in 2014. Right? I don't know how else to tell you this, but the Donbass had been in conflict since April of 2014, right? So sitting there and being like, I predicted a war. No, you didn't, dude. You stated there was an ongoing war. Again, this is something that happens if you're clueless. This is one of those things that annoyed me when the war started, and so many especially celebrities, were like, I never thought there'd be a war in Europe in my lifetime. And it's like, dude, there's been a war in Europe in your lifetime for the past 10 years. You just didn't care enough to research it until it entered your zeitgeist. So Nigel Farage extra guilty of this because he was literally sitting in EU Parliament, right, and didn't realize there was a conflict in the continent and was like, I predict a war. Okay, boss. Right? And so, one, he's already not really selling us that he knows what he's talking about here. But then he sits there and says two different things, right? He says that the eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union, right, was a pretext that Putin used to sell the war he wanted to do to the Russian people, right? That the war was going to happen anyway, and it let Putin sell the war. And there might be a grain of truth to it. Early in the war, right, Putin did actually say, yo, listen, he told the Russian people that at times he cited NATO, right? But at a lot of other times, like in the Tucker Carlson interview, he hasn't said anything about NATO expansion being the threat that actually spurred him to invade Ukraine. And this is actually pretty interesting because, as we've talked about, Putin's sort of statements on this has evolved over time. And what he's sort of settled on is not so much that NATO was coming for Russia, because that sort of narrative he's just sort of abandoned it and replaced it with Ukraine was never a state to begin with, right? Ukraine was always part of Russia. It is an artificial state. You may think, but all states are kind of artificial. They're made by humans, right? This is exactly kind of the Putin-isms of this. So Putin's sitting there, and he is evolving over time how what he claims is the pretext. And the reality is that Putin invaded Ukraine, mostly, it seems, because he wanted to install a pro-Russian regime in Kiev. And this is kind of NATO adjacent, right? Because look, when there was a pro-Russian regime in Kiev before the 2014 revolution, right? Viktor Yanukovych, again, a Russian-backed candidate who literally fled to Russia when the revolution occurred, right? Said, well, we're not Russian-backed. We're just a European non-aligned state, right? So when Putin says, hey, go back to being non-aligned, we should correctly interpret that as code for going back to being a Russian proxy, right? Because again, while Western countries sit there and go, hey, you can join a collectivist alliance that explicitly Putin's MO is to say, listen, you become a part of the Russian state, not officially, but by having Russian proxies rule over you. And again, this is something that Putin's obsession with history makes clear. He really views the kings and principalities. When you install sort of a ruling class in a country that's loyal to Moscow, then you have effectively established yourself as the government of that country. All this to say that Farage is out there. It's fairly obvious. Farage seems to know on some level that this is a pretext, that Putin wants to do this. He was going to do this no matter what. And he was just creating a fiction and confusion among NATO to say, well, maybe we could have done something to stop this, right? Nothing was going to stop this short of planting, something extreme, like planting a whole NATO army on Ukraine's border, or something that was never really going to happen, right? But then Farage says, we provoked this war. Of course, it's Putin's fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse. So he goes like back and forth in a bizarre way to saying, we provoked this war, but it's Putin's fault, but it's a pretext. So Farage himself knows he's full of crap, right? But why then okay, let's take a look at this. Let's try to, a quick Google search will tell you everything you need to know about Ukraine enlargement. First off, you notice Ukraine was not on a membership action plan for NATO because Ukraine didn't control its own territory. Second, it wasn't like Ukraine aspired to NATO membership, but that's not the same thing, right? And the only thing Putin demanded was preposterously for NATO to say, stop expansion entirely. No new NATO members. If NATO promises to add no new members, we won't invade Ukraine. The problem is that would involve NATO fundamentally reworking its core treaty, right? The NATO treaty at its founding said the parties, by unanimous agreement, may invite any other European state in a position to further the principles of the treaty and contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area and accede to the treaty, enter the treaty. Right? State may become a party to the treaty by disposing its instrument of ascension with the government of the United States of America, or depositing its instrument of ascension, so like send the actual treaty to the United States, right? Like a copy of it. And the U.S. will inform each party of the deposit of each instrument of ascension. So the only restrictions are European states. Russia could join NATO. Russia is eligible to become to apply for NATO membership, right? And these states need approval of all existing member states. So, but interior member states can put forward criteria that have to be attained. So you got to ask yourself, well, wait, if Putin, wouldn't it be easier for Putin to just leverage one easily influenced NATO country instead of demanding all of NATO sign treaties, which it's not really clear that NATO can sign a treaty on behalf of all these states? So, again, this is, you see how incredibly difficult it would be for NATO to sit there and revoke its entire policy of the open door and then go ahead and say, oh, well, actually, it's fine. Russia gets to dictate, actually, when a member can and can't join. So you can see, here's a map, a current map of NATO countries, right? Now, what's worth noting is that there is here, let's see if we can find the summary here. Here we go. Here's the table. So as you can see, there were some Baltic states, but the Baltic states last joined in actually 2004. It's just a couple of these states in the Balkans that joined after 2010. And then you had 2020 membership of North Macedonia. And that's it. The remaining countries. So why did Putin view Ukraine and a sudden brisk NATO expansion when actually NATO expansion's been slowing? So you see that the biggest expansion that happened to NATO is Finland and Sweden joining in 2023 and 2024 respectively. Right? The only other expansion, again, the small nation of North Macedonia. So why are you sitting there and saying, oh, NATO expansion was coming for Russia, when it's fairly obvious that it wasn't? So again, you've got this guy, Nigel Farage. He's out there spitting something out that Putin himself says it wasn't really NATO expansion. It was the desire of Russia to establish rule over Ukraine, to expand Russia's borders to its historic edges, right? As part of Russia's 1,000-year history. These are all things Putin has said. It's clear that NATO expansion was never really on the table for Ukraine. It's clear that NATO expansion was far more incremental, was far less, was slowing over time, right? After about 2003, there was no real push to bring in another country on Russia's borders. And yet you still have people like Nigel Farage making these points, and he himself says, well, it was just a pretext, but it wasn't. A classic politician move. Anyway, guys, the only thing I want to add, if you're looking to expand your own capacity, strike gum. It's the zero sugar energy drink alternative. As much caffeine as an energy drink, zero sugar in every piece, 90 milligrams of caffeine, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, made right here in the USA, available for sale at strikegum.com or on Amazon. And thanks to everybody that's left us reviews telling people that we're the real deal, right? Made in the USA, high quality ingredients, natural caffeine, none of the fake stuff. Thanks so much. Thanks to our Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. I couldn't do this without you guys. Please subscribe to the channel if you like these videos, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.